Honourable for Calgary Climb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is a great honour to move second reading of Bill 206, the Societies Preventing the Promotion of Hate Amendment Act. Mr. Speaker, there has been a disturbing rise in organized hate groups around the world, and unfortunately this is also true right here in Alberta. And why do we know this? Because they've become emboldened. They've become visible. And I'm not going to speculate on the reasons for this brazenness. I have my suspicions, but I'll leave that to the experts, Mr. Speaker. But the fact is, Mr. Speaker, hate groups appear to feel it's a good time to rise, that it's a good time to crawl from the dark corners of the internet and publicly share their hate with other Albertans. And Albertans should be concerned and appalled. And it is the brazenness of these groups in Alberta that was the impetus for me bringing Bill 206 forward. Seeing groups such as the World Coalition Against Islam openly promote their message on the steps of the Calgary City Hall did something to me, Mr. Speaker. It made me concerned. More than concerned, Mr. Speaker. I was appalled and disgusted that the past 50 years of progress on inclusion was disappearing, or at the very least, that it was being challenged. So what I said to myself, Mr. Speaker, was that there must be something that can be done to, in some way, stifle the potential upswing of these hate groups trying to gain traction and influence a new generation to join these hate-filled organizations. Which brought me to tabling Bill 206, Mr. Speaker, in looking for some way to bring forward legislation to limit the ability of hate groups to grow. I discovered that becoming a registered society in Alberta is a fairly simple process, and most alarmingly, that the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, Mr. Speaker, was officially a society in Alberta until 2003. And Mr. Speaker, much to my amazement, the postal code of the KKK application that was attached to the application was actually in my riding of Calgary Climb. Very concerning. As such, Mr. Speaker, the opportunity was presented. The ability of hate groups to be a legitimate society or organization in Alberta must be stopped, and this is what this bill will achieve. Mr. Speaker, Bill 206 amends the Societies Act by adding the term lawful purpose in Section 1. That is the most important part of this legislation, Mr. Speaker, as it gives the registrar the ability to consider the purpose of an applicant to become a society from a perspective that considers that its intentions are for a lawful purpose. While this seems obvious, Mr. Speaker, I have already noted that the KKK was a society until 2003, and without passing this legislation, there is nothing to stop this infamous hate group from re-registering as a society in Alberta. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is not complicated. In fact, it's common sense legislation that blocks hate groups from becoming legitimized as a society in Alberta. The second primary change in, in Bill 206 is that it puts the onus on the director of the society that the group applying for status has a lawful purpose, and to ensure that this is not only valid at the time of application, but that this declaration is carried out indefinitely. Now, Mr. Speaker, a very important and positive consequence of the changes being proposed in Bill 206 is the fact that without being able to become a legitimate society, hate groups will not be able to accumulate wealth as a society. Societies are able to own and inherit property. And much like any other organization, Mr. Speaker, it is money that enables a registered society to sustain itself and to grow. And isn't it great that this legislation will stand in the way of both legitimizing and development of these hate groups? I think so, Mr. Speaker. British Columbia adopted this language into its Societies Act in 2015 and did so for the same reasons in which I bring this forward. I spoke with the Alberta Muslim Public Affairs Council and the Calgary Jewish Federation, who endorsed this bill and applaud not only the symbolism of it, but the practical step it takes to not permit hate groups to have official status. I also spoke with those who work to combat hate groups and have an intimate understanding of the inner workings of these groups, including retired RCMP officer Terry Wilson and Cam Stewart of the Alberta Human Rights Commission, who also works closely monitoring hate groups in Alberta. Mr. Wilson, who specialized in hate groups and is very familiar with the BC legislation, sees Bill 206 as a positive step forward in confronting hate groups. For Mr. Wilson, the biggest thing for him is the fact that this legislation limits the ability of these groups to accumulate wealth. And I couldn't agree more. And I've had a lot of questions from media and other interested parties around how this legislation will be carried out. That is, are there currently organizations that promote hate who have society status in Alberta? Well, the answer to that is that we actually don't know at this point. And there's no intention to go through the 50,000 registered societies in Alberta to attempt to uncover groups whose sole purpose is hate. But Bill 206 will allow the registrar to use the criteria of lawful purpose when reviewing the yearly financials of current societies and to apply this to new applicants and those who may try to revive their society status, such as the KKK. And again, Mr. Speaker, without this legislation, there is nothing to stop the KKK from renewing its status as a society in Alberta. And there's nothing to stop the emboldened hate groups that we've seen come onto the scene recently. On the advice of Mr. Wilson, and something that I understand was done in BC in concurrence with the legislation, Alberta's registrars will be encouraged to have a relationship with the province's hate crime units to have an understanding of how hate groups are operating, under what names they're operating, and to keep apprised of the trends in this area to allow them to carry out this legislation in the most effective way possible. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to dwell on the past and wonder why this simple piece of legislation wasn't enacted years ago. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it is my understanding that the Premier's father and former leader of the Alberta New Democrats, Grant Notley, attempted to make similar changes to the Societies Act during his time in the Assembly here. And he also cited the fact that the KKK was granted society status. No, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to lament on the past. I just want to move forward with this government's goal to make life better for all Albertans and to continue to move forward towards a more inclusive, kinder society. I do, however, Mr. Speaker, want to make a comment outside of this legislation, a comment that is nonetheless germane to the topic of hate and hate groups overall. And that is that we have individuals and groups right here in Alberta who may not be directly related to hate groups, but do, however, foment hate in our society, like the opposition's close friends and allies at the rebel media. We need to stand up to these organizations, Mr. Speaker, and let them know that it's not okay to stir the toxins in the well. So to recap, Mr. Speaker, there are really two main reasons for introducing this legislation. First, by not permitting hate groups to become societies, we as a government and as a greater society are not giving hate groups legitimacy. We will not acknowledge them as an entity under the law, and we are making a statement that their ideas are not welcome. Secondly, it puts the onus on directors of societies to ensure that a society does have a lawful purpose and that it remains that way. And Mr. Speaker, without having a society status, it will not allow hate groups to accumulate wealth, the wealth that allows them to thrive and grow. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I ask that everyone in this Assembly support this bill, and in doing so, help keep Alberta the inclusive society that we all want it to be now and into the future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.